And finally, we're going to talk about races. After Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis had arisen from Homo erectus and Homo ergaster, they spread throughout all the contiguous continents which compose the supercontinent Pangaea. As continental drift continued, subpopulations developed and adapted to the respective environments as the continents drifted more or less into their current position. Continental plates merged and abutted, mountain ranges rose in new regions, and the worldwide trade winds and currents developed to be more or less patterned as they are today, though they're being affected by global climate change. As the continents we know today position themselves in locations which we are familiar with, the weather patterns which established themselves before the advent of man-made global climate change became more consistent and with the latitudes and longitudes and solar exposure. So we had the Arctic or polar zones north and south, cold zones north and south, temperate zone north and south, subtropical and tropical zones both north and south. It was the climate of the various areas of the planet which was responsible for development of the slight variations which produced the subsets of humans, which were designated as races for political reasons. No biological ones or even real ones that are of any meaning at all. It was a matter of losing melanin in the skin, which was a protection from intense solar rays, or production of vitamin D in areas where the sun's rays were less intense. The gene pool amongst these races never changed, much, which is why no subspecies developed at all, and all the races were perfectly capable of interbreeding. For some unknown reason, though, the Caucasians, to whom I refer as pigmentally challenged, somehow had the feeling that having no melanin or reduced amounts made them somehow superior to those who had more melanocytes in their skin. Actually, the reason for the Caucasian subgroup to find that those with more pigment were inferior had more to do with economics than with any true consideration of biological inferiority. Before the determination that dark-skinned persons were inferior and therefore good subjects for slavery, poor persons in their own society or captives of war were considered as good material for slavery. Those with a need for slaves used them for a variety of different purposes to determine the function. Many scholars look at repetitive descriptions in the text that were written around the time and reports of other cultures from well-documented Greco-Roman culture, and even in the Bible there's talk of slavery, and that made some people think it was justified. One of the slaves' main functions was as status symbols for the upper members of society, especially when it came down to dowries for their daughters. These slaves could be sold or given away as needed, but also showed that the family was capable of providing generous amounts for their daughters to be married off. They also catered to the needs of the temple and had more domestic abilities, such as keeping up the household and raising farm animals and small amounts of crops. Masters often took advantage of their slaves, being at their beck and call, by requiring them to perform duties in public that the master had the ability to do himself. This showed a level of luxury which extended beyond the primitive sphere into the public. In addition to showing luxury, possession of slaves was necessary for a good family background, and many wealthy men viewed their colleagues who possessed only few slaves as a type of individual who needed to be pitied. The slavery acceptability culture was perpetuated throughout all civilized societies, it seems, but eventually the notion that the rights of those with the same characteristics as their masters should be respected made enslaving members of one's own society less than desirable. So then it became a situation where those who were in dire financial straits sold themselves in the condition of indentured servitude. This became a standard all over the civilized world until the persons of color were slowly placed into positions of inferiority, mostly by manipulating the poor populations from which slaves and indentured servants had been selected, into believing that, for one reason or another, the persons with more pigment were less fit to control their own destiny because of their more primitive natures, which were, it was proposed, much more childlike, yet subject to fits of animalistic lust, murderous rage, or both. In many societies, the persons of darker color were even characterized as being much more like chimpanzees than the real human beings in order to justify all manner of cruel and inhumane treatment. Why would the members of Caucasian races have developed such a feeling of superiority? Well, look at the climatological map that we looked at before. Caucasian races developed, as I've mentioned, in the cold zones and the colder portions of the moderate or temperate zones, where the rays of the sun were less direct even during the summer months, so that development of cholecalciferol, which is a vitamin D3 and vitamin D precursor, is important for the absorption of calcium from the stomach and for the functioning of calcium in the body. Cholecalciferol is used to treat or prevent many conditions caused by lack of vitamin D, especially conditions of the skin or bones. So one can see why the proper amount of irradiation is essential, and why in areas of lower radiation there would be a need to have little or no melanocytes in order for enough irradiation for proper development of cholecalciferol, so the populations which originated in those areas were light-skinned. Along with light skin, the lack of many major metals and shorter growing periods for food plants and the animals which fed on them made resources much scarcer than was the case in warmer climatological areas, where resources were more scarce. Conflicts were, of course, unavoidable, as populations from one area inevitably were forced to actively compete with the populations from another over food and other resources. Family groups became tribes, and tribes became villages, and villages became city-states, and city-states became countries. The logistics and sociological implications and mechanisms of development of Caucasian civilizations have been discussed in many historical textbooks all over the place. And I'm not going to go over all of it, not over all the mechanics of establishing trade agreements or fighting wars or any of that. It's all found in various textbooks. Ultimately, what occurred is darker-skinned individuals were relegated to positions of inferiority to one extent or another, whether those were as slaves in the early U.S. or British colonies and protectorates, or later as servants after the U.S. Civil War, which, after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, resulted in blacks, Native Americans, Polynesians, and Indians being considered equals under the law. Didn't matter what the color was. Again, as a biologist, I must remind anyone reading this that all of the so-called races are basically identical genetically. Ultimately, the reasons for distinctions were devised for political and economic gain by conservative religious organizations, corrupt governments, and corporations which needed to have cheap slave labor, even at the cost of their souls. If we look at the true character of population in subtropical and tropical zones, they did not need to compete, which is why they were easily taken advantage of by populations of the more competitive sort. The true decency in these populations is best personified and represented by this example. What they say here: an anthropologist proposed a game to the kids in an African tribe. He put a basket of fruit near a tree and told the kids that the first one to find the fruits would win them all. When he told them to run, they all took each other's hands and ran together, then sat together enjoying their fruits. When he asked them why they ran like that, as one could have taken all the fruit for oneself, they said, "Ubuntu, how can one of us be happy if all the others are sad?" The problem, which was promulgated and perpetuated amongst poor, suffering Caucasian population by capitalistic manipulators, was that they were not really poor, but they were temporarily embarrassed millionaires who could realize a new wealthy lifestyle any day as long as they kept the dark-skinned inferiors from rising up and taking over their jobs, taking their families, whereupon they would be free to rape their wives and daughters. With the people of color constituting such a constant threat in the minds of the less educated Caucasian populations, it was easy to perpetuate a culture based on racial hatred. This thought pattern and culture can be used and manipulated by the unscrupulous to turn these less aware individuals in any direction that they wish, and to convince them to commit all manner of mayhem in the name of some god or another, because that is what the corporate manipulators love to do. They've evolved to exercise power, and they worship the god Mammon, which is just money. Ultimately, at this time, we see the end of the road for descent with modification. And we also understand why it is that we got somebody like Donald Trump elected as our president.